Welcome to Sophia's Stoicism. Have you ever been in a situation where someone treated you like a backup plan? Where you gave your all only to receive breadcrumbs in return? What if I told you that the most powerful thing you could do isn't to fight harder for their attention, but to simply disappear? Today, we're diving deep into one of the most profound psychological phenomena I've encountered in my years studying Stoic philosophy and human behavior. We're going to explore what happens in the human mind when someone they've taken for granted simply vanishes from their life. But more importantly, we're going to discover how this ancient wisdom can transform your life and relationships forever. I'm Sophia, and if you're new to this channel, we explore practical Stoicism for modern life, how ancient wisdom can solve today's relationship and personal growth challenges. Today's topic is particularly close to my heart because it's something I've both experienced and witnessed countless times. But before we begin, I want you to do something. Think of that one person who's been treating you like an option. Got them in mind? Good. Because by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why walking away might be the kindest thing you can do for both of you. The Stoic Foundation, understanding detachment. Marcus Aurelius once wrote in his Meditations, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength." This single quote encapsulates everything we're about to discuss today. The concept of walking away isn't about revenge or manipulation. It's about reclaiming your dignity and understanding your inherent worth. In Stoic philosophy, we call this concept preferred indifferences, recognizing that while we may prefer certain outcomes, our happiness and peace shouldn't depend on them. Let me share a personal story that changed my perspective forever. 3 years ago, I was in a relationship where I constantly felt like I was auditioning for love. Every text I sent felt like a plea for attention. Every plan I made revolved around their availability. I was living in what I now recognize as emotional slavery, dependent on someone else's validation for my own sense of worth. The breakthrough came when I discovered Epictetus's teaching. Wealth consists in not having great possessions, but in having few wants. I realized this applied not just to material wealth, but to emotional wealth too. The less I needed from others, the richer I became in spirit. When I finally implemented what I'm about to share with you today, everything changed. Not just in that relationship, but in how I approached every human connection afterward. The person who once ignored my calls started leaving voicemails. The friend who took me for granted began making actual effort. But here's the beautiful irony. By the time they changed, I no longer needed them to. Stage 1. The shock of sudden absence. When reality hits. The shock of sudden absence. When reality hits. The first stage someone experiences when you disappear is what psychologists call cognitive dissonance, the mental discomfort of having their expectations completely shattered. They never expected you to actually leave because, in their mind, you were part of the furniture of their life. Think about it from their perspective. You were the one who always texted first. You were the one who made plans. You were the one who seemed to care more. In their mental model of the relationship, you were the constant, the given, the sure thing. Suddenly removing yourself creates what I call expectation whiplash. I remember counseling a friend, let's call her Maria, who was dealing with a similar situation. She had been dating someone for 8 months who treated their relationship like a casual hobby, something he'd engage with when he had nothing better to do. Maria would wait by her phone, rearrange her schedule around his availability, and constantly wonder where she stood. One day, after another instance of being stood up for a better offer, Maria decided to try the disappearing act. She didn't send the usual "Are we still on for tonight?" text, She didn't call to check in. She simply vanished from his digital world. The results were immediate and dramatic. Within 48 hours, he had sent her more messages than he had in the previous month combined. "Hey, how's your day? Did I do something wrong? I miss talking to you." The man who barely acknowledged her existence was suddenly desperate for any form of contact. This isn't about playing games. It's about creating space for truth to emerge. When you remove yourself from someone's life without explanation, you force them to confront the reality of what they've lost. The Stoics understood this principle deeply. Seneca wrote, "What is grief but an opinion?" Meaning that loss only has the power we give it. But first, people must recognize that loss has occurred. The shock phase is characterized by several psychological mechanisms. Reactance theory. When people feel their freedom is threatened, in this case, their assumed access to you, they desire it more intensely. Your absence becomes a constraint they want to overcome. The scarcity principle. Something becomes more valuable when it's rare or unavailable. Your consistent availability made you common. Your sudden absence makes you precious. Pattern disruption. Human brains love patterns and predictability. When you break the established pattern of always being available, it creates psychological tension that demands resolution. But here's what makes this particularly powerful from a Stoic perspective. You're not doing this to manipulate them. You're doing this to honor yourself. You're recognizing that your time, energy, and emotional investment are valuable resources that should be treasured, not taken for granted. The ancient Stoic principle of preferred indifferences teaches us that while we may prefer to be treated well, we don't need it for our fundamental well-being. This mindset shift is liberating because it means you're not disappearing from a place of neediness or revenge. You're disappearing from a place of strength and self-respect. Stage 2. The growing void. When emptiness becomes unbearable. After the initial shock wears off, something more profound begins to happen. They start to feel the void. Not just your physical absence, but the absence of everything you brought to their life. This is where the real psychological transformation begins. You see, when someone takes you for granted, they unconsciously rely on you for emotional regulation, entertainment, validation, and stability. You become like background music in a restaurant, not consciously noticed, but creating an atmosphere that would be immediately missed if it disappeared. I learned this lesson painfully in my early 20s. I had a friend, let's call him David, who I considered one of my closest companions. We'd known each other since college, and I was always the one maintaining our friendship. I'd organize our hangouts, remember his birthday, check in during tough times, and celebrate his successes. David, meanwhile, treated our friendship like a convenience store, something he'd visit when he needed something but never thought about otherwise. The breaking point came during a particularly difficult period in my life. My father had been diagnosed with a serious illness, and I was struggling emotionally. I reached out to David multiple times, hoping for support or even just a listening ear. His responses were minimal, distracted, almost dismissive. Meanwhile, he continued to contact me whenever he needed advice about his dating life or career decisions. Instead of confronting him or expressing my hurt, I decided to try something different. I simply stopped being available. No more initiated conversations, no more birthday reminders, no more check-ins. I didn't block him or create drama, I just stepped back. The transformation was remarkable. Within 2 weeks, David was reaching out more frequently than he had in months. But it wasn't just the frequency, it was the quality of his messages. Suddenly, he was asking about my life, remembering details from previous conversations, even suggesting activities we could do together. But here's the crucial part. By the time he started making effort, I had already begun to feel the void in reverse. I realized how much emotional energy I had been investing in a one-sided relationship. The space I created wasn't just affecting him, It was revealing to me how much of myself I had been giving away without reciprocity. This stage is particularly powerful because it operates on multiple psychological levels. Hedonic adaptation. People quickly adapt to positive experiences and start taking them for granted. Your consistent presence became their baseline normal. Only when it's removed do they realize it was actually a positive force in their life. The Benjamin Franklin effect. Paradoxically, when people do favors for others, they tend to like them more. You had been doing emotional favors, listening, supporting, being available, which made you valuable to them, but they didn't consciously recognize this value until it was gone. Attachment theory. Even in casual relationships, people form attachment bonds. When you suddenly disappear, it triggers their attachment system, making them feel anxious and seeking reconnection. From a Stoic perspective, this stage teaches us about the difference between being needed and being valued. Marcus Aurelius reminds us, the best revenge is not to be like your enemy. You're not trying to hurt them by creating this void. You're simply refusing to be unvalued. The void they feel isn't just about missing you. It's about missing the version of themselves that existed when you were in their life. You brought out certain qualities in them, made them feel a certain way, provided a type of interaction they can't easily replace. This realization is both humbling and eye-opening for them. But here's what I want you to understand about this stage. The void they feel is real, but it's not your responsibility to fill it. The Stoic concept of impressions teaches us that we can't control how others feel about our actions. We can only control our actions themselves. If they feel empty without you, that's information for them to process, not a problem for you to solve.
Stage 3. The curiosity trap. When questions consume the mind. Ideal for the curiosity trap. When questions consume the mind. Human beings are naturally curious creatures, but when that curiosity can't be satisfied, it transforms into something much more intense, an obsession. This is exactly what happens in stage 3, when someone you've walked away from becomes consumed with questions about your life. The psychology behind this is fascinating. When we have access to information about someone, we take it for granted. But when that access is suddenly cut off, our brains interpret it as a puzzle that needs solving. The more elusive the information becomes, the more valuable it seems. I witnessed this phenomenon firsthand with my client Sarah, name changed for privacy. Sarah had been in a situationship with a colleague for over a year. He would text her when he was bored, invite her over when it was convenient, but never made any real commitment or effort to build something meaningful. Sarah felt stuck in limbo, always wondering where she stood. After months of this pattern, Sarah decided to implement the disappearing strategy. She stopped responding to his casual texts, declined his last-minute invitations, and most importantly, she went completely dark on social media. No stories, no posts, no digital footprints for him to follow. The transformation was immediate and almost comical. This man, who previously needed to be reminded that Sarah existed, suddenly became a digital detective. He started asking mutual coworkers about her, checked her LinkedIn obsessively, and even asked friends to show him her social media from their accounts. What fascinated me most was how his behavior revealed the depth of his previous indifference. He admitted later that he had never actually wondered about Sarah's life when he had easy access to information about it. Only when she became a mystery did she become interesting. This curiosity stage operates on several psychological principles. The information gap theory. When we perceive a gap between what we know and what we want to know, it creates a psychological itch that demands scratching. Your absence creates the ultimate information gap. The Zygarnik effect.
People remember interrupted or incomplete tasks better than completed ones. By disappearing without explanation, you create an incomplete interaction that their brain keeps trying to resolve. Social media dependency. In our hyper-connected world, we're used to having constant updates about people's lives. When someone goes dark, it feels like a television show suddenly going off the air mid-season. But here's where the Stoic wisdom becomes crucial. This curiosity isn't really about you. It's about their need for control and certainty. Epictetus taught us that the desire to control external circumstances is the root of human suffering. When someone becomes obsessed with knowing what you're doing, they're experiencing this suffering firsthand. I remember my own experience with this dynamic. After implementing the disappearing strategy with someone who had been treating me as an option, I watched as they became increasingly frantic for information about my life. They would show up at places they knew I frequented, ask mutual friends casual questions about me, and even create fake social media accounts to try to see my posts. What fascinated me most was how his behavior revealed the depth of his previous indifference. He admitted later that he had never actually wondered about Sarah's life when he had easy access to information about it. Only when she became a mystery did she become interesting. This curiosity stage operates on several psychological principles. The information gap theory. When we perceive a gap between what we know and what we want to know, it creates a psychological itch that demands scratching. Your absence creates the ultimate information gap. The Zeigarnik effect. People remember interrupted or incomplete tasks better than completed ones. By disappearing without explanation, you create an incomplete interaction that their brain keeps trying to resolve. Social media dependency. In our hyper-connected world, we're used to having constant updates about people's lives. When someone goes dark, it feels like a television show suddenly going off the air mid-season. But here's where the Stoic wisdom becomes crucial. This curiosity. Stage 4. The mirror of self-reflection. When truth becomes unavoidable. Perhaps the most transformative stage for the person you've walked away from is when they're forced to look in the mirror and examine their own behavior. This stage doesn't happen immediately. It usually takes several weeks or even months of your absence before they move beyond curiosity and into genuine self-examination. Self-reflection is painful because it requires admitting fault, acknowledging mistakes, and confronting uncomfortable truths about oneself. Most people avoid this process at all costs, which is why they often need external pressure, like someone's sudden absence, to begin it. Let me share a story that perfectly illustrates this principle. A few years ago, I was coaching a woman named Lisa, whose adult son had been taking advantage of her generosity for years. He would call only when he needed money, visit only when he wanted a home-cooked meal, and treated her home like a free hotel and laundry service. Despite Lisa's repeated attempts to address this dynamic, nothing changed. Finally, Lisa decided to implement a version of the disappearing strategy. She stopped answering his calls immediately, stopped offering unsolicited help, and made herself unavailable for his convenience. Most importantly, she stopped enabling his behavior through constant emotional labor. The initial response was predictable. He became angry and defensive. He accused her of being selfish and unsupportive. But something interesting happened after about 6 weeks of this new dynamic. He called Lisa one evening and, for the first time in years, asked how she was doing without immediately launching into his own problems. During that conversation, he made a statement that revealed the depth of his self-reflection. "Mom, I've been thinking about how I've been treating you, and I realized I've been a terrible son. I never appreciated everything you did for me until you stopped doing it."
This moment of genuine self-awareness didn't happen overnight. It required weeks of Lisa's absence from his life for him to move beyond anger and into honest self-examination. The key was that Lisa didn't explain why she had pulled back. She simply created space for him to figure it out himself. The psychology behind this stage is rooted in what researchers call cognitive dissonance resolution. When someone's behavior doesn't align with their self-image, most people like to think of themselves as good, fair, and considerate. They experience psychological discomfort. They can resolve this discomfort in two ways: by changing their behavior or by changing their self-image. Initially, they'll try to change their self-image, telling themselves you were too needy, too sensitive, or too demanding. But when you're not there to blame, when they can't project their discomfort onto you, they're left with only one option: examining their own actions. This is where the Stoic principle of the discipline of action becomes relevant. Epictetus taught that we should examine our own behavior regularly, asking ourselves whether our actions align with our values. When you disappear from someone's life, you're essentially forcing them to do this examination, not through confrontation or explanation, but through absence. I experienced this personally in a friendship that had become completely one-sided. I was always the one planning activities, remembering important events, and providing emotional support. My friends treated our relationship like a subscription service, something that would always be there when needed, requiring no maintenance or investment from her side. After months of feeling taken for granted, I decided to step back. I didn't send my usual weekly check-in texts, didn't make plans for us to meet, and didn't respond immediately to her messages when they did come. I wasn't being vindictive. I was simply matching her level of investment in our friendship. The self-reflection stage took about 2 months to emerge. Initially, she seemed not to notice the change. Then she became mildly annoyed that I wasn't as available as usual. But eventually, she began to examine the pattern of our friendship. The breakthrough came when she called me one day and said, "I've been thinking about our friendship, and I realized I've been really selfish. I always expect you to reach out, to make plans, to remember things, but I never do the same for you. I don't know why I thought that was okay." This moment of self-awareness was profound, not just for our friendship, but for her personal growth. She began to examine other relationships in her life and realized she had a pattern of taking people for granted. My absence had served as a catalyst for broader self-improvement. However, here's the crucial Stoic insight. The goal of disappearing isn't to force someone into self-reflection. That's trying to control an external outcome, which goes against Stoic principles. The goal is to honor your own worth by not accepting poor treatment. If self-reflection happens as a result. Stage 5, the reversal, when the pursuer becomes the pursued. One of the most psychologically fascinating aspects of the disappearing dynamic is how it completely reverses the traditional power structure of the relationship. The person who was once being pursued suddenly becomes the pursuer, and this role reversal creates intense psychological pressure that can be almost unbearable for someone who's used to being in control. This stage represents a fundamental shift in the relationship dynamic, where once you were the one investing more energy, caring more deeply, and making more effort, suddenly they find themselves in that position. For someone who's accustomed to being the object of pursuit rather than the pursuer, this experience can be deeply unsettling. I observed this transformation in a coaching client I'll call Michael. He had been casually dating a woman named Jennifer for about 4 months. From his description, it was clear that Jennifer was far more invested in the relationship than he was. She would text him first, suggest activities, and generally put in most of the emotional labor to keep their connection alive. Michael enjoyed the attention, but wasn't ready for anything serious. He liked knowing that Jennifer was interested and available, but he also liked keeping his options open. In his mind, he had the perfect situation: companionship when he wanted it, without any real commitment or effort on his part. Everything changed when Jennifer suddenly stopped being available. She stopped initiating conversations, declined his casual invitations, and seemed to have become genuinely busy with other aspects of her life. For the first time in their dynamic, Michael found himself in the position of wondering where he stood. Initially, he was merely curious about her sudden change in behavior. But as days turned into weeks, curiosity transformed into something more intense, a genuine desire to reconnect. He found himself doing things he had never done before, suggesting specific plans days in advance, remembering details from their previous conversations, and even bringing up the possibility of exclusivity. The psychological mechanisms at work here are complex and fascinating. Intermittent reinforcement. When Jennifer was consistently available, Michael experienced what psychologists call continuous reinforcement. He knew he could get attention whenever he wanted it. When she became unavailable, it created intermittent reinforcement, which is actually more addictive and compelling than consistent availability. Reactance theory. When people perceive that their freedom of choice is being restricted, in this case, Michael's assumption that he could access Jennifer whenever he wanted, they experience psychological reactance, an increased desire for the restricted option. The paradox of choice. Having too many options can actually decrease satisfaction and increase anxiety. When Michael felt he had unlimited access to Jennifer plus other options, the choice felt less significant. When Jennifer became unavailable, she suddenly seemed more valuable than the alternatives. But here's where the Stoic perspective becomes crucial. This pursuit isn't necessarily about genuine appreciation or love. It's often about ego, control, and the psychological discomfort of losing something you thought you possessed. I learned this lesson the hard way in my own life. Years ago, I was in a situation where someone who had been treating me as an option suddenly began pursuing me intensely after I disappeared from their life. The attention was intoxicating. Finally, they were giving me the focus and effort I had craved for months. However, as I began to understand Stoic principles more deeply, I realized something uncomfortable. Their pursuit wasn't about recognizing my inherent worth as a person. It was about regaining control over a situation that had slipped from their grasp. They weren't necessarily pursuing me. They were pursuing the feeling of being in control again. This realization was both disappointing and liberating. Disappointing because I hoped their pursuit meant they had genuinely recognized my value. Liberating because it helped me understand that I didn't want someone who only valued me when I was unavailable. The pursuit stage reveals something profound about human psychology. We often confuse scarcity with value. When someone becomes scarce, they seem more valuable. But this perceived value isn't based on their actual qualities or the depth of connection you share with them. It's based on the psychological principles of supply and demand. Epictetus taught us to distinguish between what is up to us and what is not up to us. Someone else's decision to pursue you after you've walked away is definitely in the not up to us category. Your job is to evaluate whether their pursuit represents genuine recognition of.
Stage 6. The illusion of freedom. When relief transforms into regret. One of the most psychologically complex stages occurs when someone initially feels relief about your disappearance, only to have that relief gradually transform into deep regret. This stage is particularly revealing because it shows the difference between what people think they want and what they actually need for genuine happiness and fulfillment. When you first disappear from someone's life, especially if the relationship had any elements of obligation or expectation, they might experience what I call liberation euphoria. They think to themselves, finally, I don't have to deal with their needs, their expectations, their emotional demands. They feel free to do whatever they want without considering your feelings or maintaining the relationship. This initial relief is intoxicating. They might go out more, date other people, focus entirely on themselves, or simply enjoy not having to respond to texts or make plans they don't feel like making. For a brief period, they convince themselves that your absence has made their life simpler and more enjoyable. I witnessed this phenomenon with a client I'll call Robert. He had been in a long-term relationship with someone who clearly cared more about the relationship than he did. His partner, Emma, was constantly trying to deepen their connection, plan for the future, and create more intimacy between them. Robert, meanwhile, felt suffocated by what he perceived as Emma's neediness and expectations. When Emma finally got tired of feeling like she was in the relationship alone and decided to step back completely, Robert's initial reaction was relief. He told his friends he felt like he could breathe again. He enjoyed not having to check in with anyone, not having to consider someone else's feelings, and not having to engage in emotional conversations he found draining. For about 6 weeks, Robert lived in this state of perceived freedom. He went out with friends without explaining himself, worked late without considering anyone else's schedule, and generally enjoyed what he thought was independence. He even started casual relationships with other people, convinced that he was happier without the complications that Emma had brought to his life. But something interesting happened around the 2-month mark. The excitement of freedom began to wear off, and Robert started to notice what was missing from his life. The casual relationships felt empty compared to the depth he had shared with Emma. His achievements felt less meaningful without someone who genuinely cared to share them with. His daily experiences felt flatter without someone who knew him well enough to understand their significance. The psychology behind this transformation is rooted in what researchers call hedonic adaptation, our tendency to return to a baseline level of happiness despite positive changes in our circumstances. The relief Robert felt was temporary, but the loss of genuine connection was permanent as long as Emma remained absent from his life. What makes this stage particularly poignant is that it reveals the difference between surface-level desires and deeper human needs. On the surface, Robert wanted freedom from obligation and expectation, but at a deeper level, he needed connection, intimacy, and the unique form of validation that comes from being truly known and accepted by another person. This dynamic reflects what the Stoics understood about the difference between pleasure and genuine well-being. Seneca wrote extensively about how the pursuit of immediate pleasure often conflicts with long-term happiness. The relief someone feels when freed from relationship obligations is a form of immediate pleasure, but it doesn't address deeper needs for connection and meaning. I experienced a version of this myself, though from the opposite perspective. After disappearing from the life of someone who had been taking me for granted, I initially felt a similar sense of relief. I no longer had to wonder where I stood, analyze mixed signals, or invest emotional energy in someone who wasn't reciprocating. But as weeks passed, I began to recognize something important. The relief I felt wasn't about being free from that specific person. It was about being free from accepting poor treatment. The lesson wasn't that relationships are burdensome, but that relationships without mutual respect and appreciation are burdensome. This realization helped me understand why the relief to regret transformation is so common. People often confuse the burden of maintaining a one-sided relationship with the burden of relationship itself. When you disappear, they initially feel relieved to be free from what they perceived as demands and expectations. But gradually, they realize that what they thought were burdens were actually gifts, someone caring about them, wanting to connect with them, and investing in their well-being. The regret stage is characterized by a deeper understanding of what was lost. They begin to recognize that availability isn't the same as neediness. Your consistent presence wasn't clinginess, it was reliability. And
Stage 6. The illusion of freedom, when relief transforms into regret.
Stage 7. The manipulation phase, when desperation drives strategy. As someone progresses through the stages of missing your presence, they often reach a point where desperation overrides dignity, leading them to attempt various manipulation tactics to regain your attention. This stage is particularly revealing because it shows how far someone will go to regain control when they realize that their usual methods of maintaining relationships are no longer working. Manipulation in this context isn't necessarily malicious. It's often unconscious and driven by panic, rather than calculated malice. When someone realizes they're losing access to you, their primitive brain kicks into survival mode, employing whatever strategies it thinks might work to re-establish connection. These manipulation attempts typically fall into several categories. The jealousy gambit. They start posting photos with other people, talking about dates they're going on, or making sure mutual friends know about their active social life. The goal is to make you feel like you're missing out, or to trigger jealousy that might bring you back. The pity play. They share stories about difficult things happening in their life, hoping to trigger your empathy and caring nature. They know you're a compassionate person, so they try to use that compassion to draw you back in. The anger strategy. They become hostile or dismissive, trying to provoke a reaction from you. Sometimes negative attention feels better than no attention at all, so they'll try to start an argument or conflict just to get you to engage. The casual contact. They reach out with seemingly innocent questions or observations, pretending that nothing has changed while hoping to re-establish regular communication. Let me share a story that perfectly illustrates this phase. I was working with a client named Rachel who had been in an on and off situationship with someone for over a year. He would be intensely interested for a few weeks, then would disappear or become distant, leaving Rachel constantly confused about where she stood. After months of this pattern, Rachel decided to implement the disappearing strategy. She stopped responding to his mixed signals and became completely unavailable. Initially, he didn't seem to notice or care, but after a few weeks, the manipulation tactics began. First came the jealousy attempts. He started posting pictures of himself at social events with attractive people, making sure these posts would be visible to Rachel and their mutual friends. When this didn't provoke a response, he escalated to more direct tactics. Next was the pity play. He reached out to tell Rachel about a difficult situation at work, framing it as if he really needed someone to talk to and she was the only person who would understand. When Rachel didn't respond to this either, he tried the anger approach. He sent her a message criticizing her for being cold and uncaring, suggesting that her silence revealed negative things about her character. This was a calculated attempt to make her feel guilty enough to break her silence and defend herself. Finally, when none of these strategies worked, he tried the casual contact approach, sending her a simple "How have you been?" message as if nothing had happened, hoping to reset their dynamic to a more comfortable baseline. The fascinating thing about Rachel's situation was that she was able to observe these manipulation attempts with clarity because she had created enough emotional distance to see them